Well, welcome to Christian Answers. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and today I'm going to be talking about the Revolutionary War and the Christian response to the Revolutionary War. And the reason I'm bringing up this topic is because it was brought up on the Ben Shapiro show on his Sunday special when he was interviewing Pastor John Macarthur of Grace Community Church out in California. And one of the topics that they talked about was the Christian reaction or response to the Revolutionary War. And Ben Shapiro asked John Macarthur, specifically said, what do you think of Christians and revolution? Do you think Christians should ever fight against the established authorities? Do you think Christians should ever fight in a revolutionary war? Should they take up arms against the king or the ruling authority? And John Macarthur very quickly said, no, Christians should never, ever fight against the government. Christians should never take up arms or kill a king, as they did in France and some of the other countries. And Christians should not be revolutionaries and should not fight against government because of what God has said in the book of Romans. It says the established authorities are there by God's will for the common good. And he quotes Paul's writings there in Romans to justify that Christians should never, ever take up arms. And Ben Shapiro asked him a couple other times, like, well, are there any instances where Christians would be justified in revolting against the ruling authorities? And again, Macarthur said no. Christians don't revolt. Christians don't participate in revolutions. Christians submit to the ruling authorities, as the Apostle Paul says. Well, when I began to listen to that interview, I began to realize that either Pastor John Macarthur doesn't know the whole discussion or the whole conversation, but this has been a debate topic for decades and decades and decades. I first ran into this in the writings of Norman Geisler some 30 years ago when I was going through seminary. There are Christians on both sides of this issue. It's not a cut and dried, slam dunk, no question, this is the right answer, that is the wrong answer. It's not so simple as Pastor John Macarthur would have us believe. His reading of Romans, where it says Christians should submit themselves to the ruling authority because the ruling authorities are established by God, that is a general principle. Why do we know that that's a general principle? What that means is it's a general truth. It holds, all things being equal, in the normal state of affairs. Yes, you are to submit yourselves to the ruling authorities. You are to not revolt. You are not to rebel against the ruling authorities. So he's right there. John Macarthur is right in stating a general truth. But he is incorrect in taking that general truth and saying that's an absolute truth. Under any circumstances, Christians should never, ever revolt or rebel against governing authorities. That is an error on his part. He's taking a general truth, the kinds of truths that you have, for example, in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs gives us all kinds of wisdom, and we're supposed to heed that wise advice and the wise teachings in the book of Proverbs. But those are general truths. They hold most of the time. They hold the vast majority of the time. You might even say 99.999% of the time. But then there are always those rare exceptions where those general truths do not hold. And so that's why they're general truths. They're not absolute commands. There are many, many absolute commands in the Bible, and those are those that hold 100% of the time. So we are commanded many things by God and in an absolute way, but then other things we are commanded in a general way. So let me give an example why I think John Macarthur needs to realize that there is a wider conversation, there is a bigger conversation than he is portraying in his conversation with Ben Shapiro. For example, when the apostles were told by the ruling Jewish authorities to not preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, they said, judge for yourselves whether it is right to obey men or to obey God. We will continue preaching the gospel. So in other words, they broke with the established authorities' laws. They broke the laws. They broke the Jewish ruling authorities' laws. The law that these rulers were laying down was that these Jews were to stop preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. They were told specifically by the leading ruling Jewish authorities, stop preaching the gospel. And if you were to take an absolutist view of the ruling authorities, you would say, well, then we have to stop preaching the gospel because these ruling authorities, the leading Jewish authorities of our land, are telling us to stop. So we have to, because we do not rebel. We are not revolutionaries. We obey the ruling authorities, if you want to take that as an absolute. But they didn't. The apostles did not take the command to obey the ruling authorities as an absolute. They took it as a general rule. And in the case of the Pharisees and the scribes and the Jewish leaders telling the apostles stop preaching the gospel, that was not within their purview to tell the apostles to stop doing that. It was not within their realm of authority to command the apostles to stop preaching the gospel. Jesus had said, all authority has been given unto me, and then I give you the authority to go and preach the gospel. And so Jesus authorized the apostles to preach the gospel. Jesus, being God in human flesh, the incarnation, he speaks for the Father speaks through him. Jesus said to his followers, he who sees me has seen the Father, and so on and so forth. So in other words, he brings the authority of the triune God, and when Jesus speaks, he is the ultimate authority. And he says for the apostles to go preach the gospel. The Pharisees, the scribes, the Jewish leaders were telling the apostles not to preach the gospel. So there's a conflict. So the apostles' attitude was, well, you judge, you rulers, whether it is right for us to obey you or men or to obey God. And so they said, we're going to obey God. And so they violated the established authorities' commands. And they did so out of obedience to Christ. So they were obeying a higher power. And that is the principle that I think John Macarthur did not talk about. And the principle is simply this: we are to obey the established authorities in whatever realm of authority they are in, and whatever realm of authority they have authorization over, except when it violates a command of God. Now, we see this all over the place. For example, if you want to use a more contemporary illustration, if you were, for example, we may face this very soon also. If you're a doctor and you are pro-life and you believe in the sanctity of human life and you follow God's commands, thou shalt not murder, and you are part of a healthcare network that says that you must either perform abortions or refer women to those who perform abortion, and you say, I'm sorry, but abortion is murder, and that is my deeply held religious belief, and I will not perform abortions on women, even though I'm part of this healthcare network, and I will not refer women to an abortion clinic or an abortion doctor to have an abortion, because that violates the command of God to not murder. And I don't want to be a part of an accessory to murder. And if the government says, well, you must, because we are funding your healthcare network with our Medicare or our Medicaid dollars, and so you must do this. This is the law of the land under the quote, Affordable Care Act. Abortions are included, and so you must obey us and either perform the abortions or refer the woman to an abortion doctor to have the abortion done. And if you don't, you will be jailed and fined and have your license to practice medicine removed, and so on and so forth. And that is a good example of where a Christian would say no to the ruling authorities. They would rebel against the ruling authorities. And so here is a very concrete contemporary example where Christians do not always submit to the ruling authorities, even though they are established by God. Now, when you look at Paul's writings, and when he's talking about Christians submitting to the ruling authorities because they are established by God, that means that God is a God of order, and he doesn't want chaos and anarchy loose in society. So if you have a government, even if it's not a optimal government, even if it's a semi-corrupt government, or even if it is a bad government or some kind of government, a poor government, a corrupt government, that's even better than no government, because no government means anarchy, right? No government means anarchy. And so you don't want anarchy loose in society. You don't want people just doing whatever they want to do, as in the days of Noah. You have this corrupt situation where people are running loose. There's murder taking place. There's no government authority to intervene. There is no court system. There is vigilante justice. That's where you get the rise of the mafia, where if you have a situation where there's no government, there's no ruling authority, there's no laws in the land, then you have these groups like the mafia rise up and give people sort of a shadow government, a substitute government, in which they can seek justice for offenses, or say if someone injures or murders someone, then they go to the mafia because there is no government, and so on and so forth. So you have to have a government. You have to have some kind of ruling authority, and that is what it means that God is establishing government or ruling authority or some kind of structure in society. God is not in favor of, nor did he ever intend people to simply have no government, no laws, no authorities. It's just everyone, it's a free-for-all, everyone fend for themselves. No, because that will never work in a fallen world, because there are weak people and there are strong people. There are peaceful people and there are violent people. And if you just leave people to do whatever they want to do without any government structure, the strong will rule over the weak. They will be tyrannical, and they will do injustice, and there will be no structure to correct that injustice. So God is for government. And then you get into the conversation of, okay, what is the optimal or best form of government? And that is what the revolutionaries in the Revolutionary War here in the United States were fighting for. They were fighting against what they said was the tyrannical actions of the King of England. And that was the grievance that they had with the King of England, is that he was acting in tyrannical ways. He was a tyrant. Now, the whole debate then over the Revolutionary War comes down to whether the colonists and their summary of the King of England and the offenses against the colonists, if that summary is accurate or not. Now that's where the debate can come in, because there were Christians at the time of the Revolutionary War. For example, there was John Wesley over in England. When he looked over at the colonists, and he looked over, because there were Methodists over here. There were people who had sort of gathered around the teachings of Wesley, the Wesley brothers, and because Wesley had come over to the British colonies here, and unfortunately had a failed mission. It wasn't a very successful missionary project, so he went back to England. But his good friend George Whitefield had come and gone a number of different times to the colonies and had had great success evangelizing. And Wesley and Whitefield were really good friends. And Wesley, when he began to look at the colonists and began to hear that they were going to revolt against the crown, the British crown, he wrote back to the Methodists here in the United States. He says, you know, there is no justification in the Bible for revolt, because the offenses are not grave enough, and the king, even though he be imperfect and even corrupt in some aspects, still that does not justify revolution and to rebel against established authorities. And so John Wesley, this very influential evangelical leader, was solidly against the colonists, members of his own church, the Methodist Church, against revolting against England and fighting against England and bloodshed and all that war entails. He was against that. The colonists, though, and not all of the colonists, of course there were colonists here, loyalists, good, solid evangelical Christians who agreed with Wesley and agreed with that argument. Wesley was not the only one by any means who was making the argument from the Bible. There were others in the colonies here in the United States. They were arguing the same thing. They were saying, well, we don't like the laws that are being passed in Parliament. We don't like no representation, but we're being taxed. Again, that was one of the battle cries, no taxation without representation. They didn't like that situation. They didn't, especially the tea tax. They didn't like that. That really bothered the colonists. That England was exploiting their labor. They were exploiting the colonists and using the colonists as a way to make money, and they didn't appreciate that, and they wanted some kind of understanding or some kind of resolution to this problem. And England and the king just said, well, this is the way it is because that's the way we say it is. And the colonists didn't like that attitude. But there were still colonists here in this land that said, well, we don't like that, but still, you know, to revolt, to actually rebel against the King of England and to actually pick up arms and fight and kill to redress this grievance, that's too far. That's an extreme. It doesn't fall under the biblical qualification that the apostles gave us example of, where it's better to obey God than man. Because the king at that time was not actually asking the colonists to sin. He wasn't asking them to go against any Christian conviction, right? There was nothing. He wasn't saying, you know, I want you to violate the 5th commandment of the 10 commandments. No, he wasn't trying to necessarily lead them into evil. He was going to try to exploit them financially, possibly through the taxes. He was trying to bully them. He was trying to use them for his own ends as the King of England. But he wasn't necessarily trying to lead them to do evil in the Christian understanding of the commandments and the laws of God. So the argument that the colonists should take up arms and rebel against the king basically boiled down to and the colonists and some of the other leading colonists at that time, Christian colonists, like John Witherspoon of Princeton University, his argument for revolution was that the king had usurped his authority and was tyrannical in his ruling, and that when a king usurps his authority, oversteps his legitimate earthly authority, becomes a tyrant, then it is permissible for the people under him to rise up, rebuke him, and if that doesn't work, rebel against him and even revolt against him and establish a new order. And Witherspoon drew heavily upon the 16th century theologian John Calvin in his writings in the Institutes of the Christian Religion, where John Calvin didn't spend a whole lot of time on that topic, but he did mention in certain sections of the Institute about the government's established role, and that the government's power and authority is not ultimate or absolute, and there are occasions where the government becomes tyrannical, and that they can be changed or removed, or kings can be removed and kings can be dethroned and another king can be set in his place, and so on and so forth. It wasn't a very well developed, and it wasn't a very in-depth analysis of government, but there are parts of Calvin's Institutes where he does talk about this. And so John Witherspoon and other colonists, evangelical Christian colonists, began to read some of Calvin's works and began to formulate this understanding that if the government gets to the point where it's tyrannical, then it is permissible for the people under it to remove that government and replace it with one that is righteous and just and fair and a good government. If you have a bad government and it's tyrannizing people under it, then you have the right of the people to remove the tyranny and replace it with justice and truth and righteousness. And so that was their justification for picking up arms against England and revolting against the established authorities. Now, again, I don't know if Pastor John Macarthur, has read or got into that whole big discussion, but it is a discussion, it is a debate that has been going on for many, many decades, and I've been aware of it, and it's probably gone on a lot longer than I've even been aware of it. But there are people who, upon reflection, look back to 1776 and the years before that in the Revolutionary War, and began to question, was the offense against the people, the colonists, by the King of England of sufficient level that would warrant a war? Was there truly Christian justification? Was there true biblical justification for the Revolutionary War? And I believe that's still an open question. Now, it's water under the bridge right now. It happened. Whether it was 100% justifiable or not, it happened. It's over. It's done. It's water under the bridge. And God has worked good out of it, whether it was 100% His will or whether it's something that He allowed or permitted. We can talk again about that. But this notion that a Christian never has the authority from God to rebel against a corrupt government is wrong. We know for sure that, for example, the biblical model where the apostles told the governing authorities it's better to obey God than to obey man, and judge for yourselves which is right. We see right there that there is a time when it is proper and good for Christians to say no to government and yes to God, if there's a conflict. And whether there is a true biblical conflict, that's the rub. And I think it would be good to actually have maybe John Macarthur or someone who can represent that side of the argument that says that Christians should never rebel, should never protest, should never revolt against the ruling authorities. And then bring someone in from the other side who understands the discussion and would argue against that understanding of it and say, yes, there is a time when Christians should in fact rebel. Some people, for example, like the late Francis Schaeffer, the theologian Francis Schaeffer, he actually said that according to Witherspoon and some of the Presbyterians and evangelicals of the time back in the late 1800s or late 18th century, that they actually were claiming that there is a duty of the citizens of a nation to rebel against a tyrant, to throw out the tyrant. It's a duty of citizenship to step forward and revolt against a tyrannical ruler. So they actually made that stronger argument. Francis Schaeffer made the stronger argument that's not only the right of citizens to revolt against a tyrant, but it's their duty to do so. So there is a discussion. That's what I want to say. It's not as cut and dry as Pastor John Macarthur would imply. And we need to continue to talk about this and explore, because it all hinges on the application of what constitutes a tyrannical government and what constitutes the right application of the right of Christians to remove a tyrant. And if you think that King George, or was it the King of England, was tyrannical enough to revolt against, then you will believe that the Revolutionary War was justified. If you look at the grievances and the actions of the king and say, well, yeah, they were bad, but they didn't reach the level of tyranny, then you will not agree with the Revolutionary War. But this is a discussion. It's an ongoing discussion. It's an interesting discussion. It's water under the bridge. It's over. It's done. But who knows? We may still face situations like this in the future, and it's good for us to sharpen our understanding of what God is trying to call us to do. So I hope that's been a helpful discussion, and we'll talk to you later on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.